What exactly is delivered? Is it medication supplies or is it dispensed medicines for patients?
With the initial phase of our grant, our premise when we went in was about using drone delivery to reach vulnerable populations to improve their health outcomes. So that was really the premise of the grant with the Department of Transportation. So in that, we needed to first understand what medications would the FAA allow us to deliver by drones. And so, in collaboration with our drone partner, we had discussions with the FAA around somewhat the guardrails we needed to work within. So, for example, they really did not want us to look at delivering medications that are aerosolized, for example, because they weren't quite sure what the pressure gradients would do with, say, an inhaler that has an aerosolized canister. They really did not want us to deliver any medication that would be considered a hazardous substance. In the US, there are, from the EPA, different medications that are considered hazardous if you handle them, for example, oral chemotherapy items, for example. And so they somewhat gave us some guardrails. Our next stop was to go to the Board of Pharmacy because in the United States, we're governed in the practice of pharmacy by the federal government through the FDA and the Food and Drug Administration and the Drug Enforcement Agency. But at the state level, we're governed by a state board of pharmacy. And so we had a conversation with the state board of pharmacy to let them know what we were doing to see what their concerns may be. And they did not want us to deliver any medications that may either have temperature excursion challenges. So you think about insulins and things like this, at least in the first phase. They also did not want us to deliver what we would consider to be drug DEA controlled medications that might have the potential for diversion and abuse. So that became the framework for us to say, okay, if we look at our chronic conditions where we perform worse than the state or national average on the Eastern Shore, what would those be? And the ones that would come to the top would either be cardiac conditions or our COPD asthmatics. But since the COPD patients often use inhalers, that came off of the table. And we said, if we want to really be able to measure outcomes, and we know that's not going to happen in a year, but if we want to be able to measure outcomes, then hypertension becomes the easiest because blood pressure is a very, very specific monitor that we can manage over periods of time. So that became the patient population that we wanted to target for the medication delivery. So to answer your question, at least for the premise of the grant, we are delivering filled prescriptions from our retail pharmacy for hypertension. So whether that's, their, ACE inhibitors, whether it's the diuretics, whether it's beta blockers, whatever that may be that the patient's taking for their hypertension, those would be the medications that we had an initial focus on.
Oh, you mentioned products that the Drug Enforcement Agency might be concerned about. Would those be narcotics, opioids, that sort of thing?
Yes, the Drug Enforcement Agency controls. They've got a scheduling scheme in the United States from Schedule 2 to Schedule 5, and 2 being the most likely for abuse and diversion, which would be primarily opioids, stimulants such as our ADHD drugs, and then they tend to go into lesser. Schedule 3 would include your benzodiazepines. So they were really interested in, primarily your stimulants, your opioids, your benzodiazepines, and those types of things. They really, because as we talk about delivery, and it's a little different than the patient or a patient's family member. In the United States, when you go to pick up those medications at your pharmacy, you have to show a picture ID, right? So that's one of the requirements that we have to meet within our retail pharmacies. And so obviously, if you're delivering via drone, that ability to do that and get that signature and whatnot is not there. And so the board of pharmacy said, just from a potential diversion risk, we would really not want to see you do those drug enforcement agency scheduled drugs for delivery.
So you are delivering filled prescription items. So are they being delivered directly to patients at their homes, or are they delivered to a pharmacy or clinic so that patients can collect them?
For our particular pilot, at least in phase one of the pilot, all of the deliveries were going from the hospital, which was considered the drone port for the purpose of this pilot, to an individual patient's home. Now, within that process, because of either FAA regulations, flight regulations, or drone capabilities, we had to look only at patients initially within a 2-mile radius of a hospital. So that is an FAA regulation, and it's called visual line of sight. So for our initial pilot, before we could apply for a waiver for a longer flight pattern from the FAA, we had to do things within 2 miles. In addition to that, once we identified potential patients with uncontrolled hypertension that were patients of our health system, our drone partner then mapped all the addresses, and they did geomapping analysis to say, are there any potential barriers to drone delivery because of power lines, because of tree canopy, and those types of things? So we had to then further narrow down the scope of the patients based on the drone capabilities. They wanted to make sure, especially for this initial pilot, that we go into it in a very successful manner. And so that then further limited the number of patients. Initial phase of the pilot was delivering filled prescriptions for antihypertensives to patients' homes from our hospital. Now, as we started talking about Tangier Island, which has been more in the latter phases and will be expanded upon if we're able to get phase two grant funding, that pilot looks a little bit different in that it would not be financially viable to fly a drone 17 miles over the water to deliver prescriptions to a single patient. So in that situation, our process is to fly the drone from the hospital drone port to our medical practice there, because we do have a family practice location where they can retrieve the medications from the drone, and the patients that they serve come to that clinic anyway, so they would pick up the prescriptions at the clinic. And so a little bit of a different model when we start looking at the island, because it's not really, it's one thing if you're delivering to one single patient that's 3 miles away, where that drone can get to that patient, drop the prescription, and come back within a matter of minutes, versus a specialized drone, which is what we needed to be able to get over 17 miles because of battery life. We had to use 2 different drone models, more like a small airplane that literally needs to land, have somebody remove the cargo, and then a button needs to be pushed to have it take back off. So in that model with the island, it is going to our medical practice, and then they further distribute the medications to the patients.